The morning sickness came first, then the subtle changes in her body that Grace tried desperately to hide. But in a house where every movement was watched, every deviation from routine noted, it was only a matter of time before Auntie Rita noticed. The discovery came on a humid afternoon as Grace cleaned the kitchen floor. "Your stomach is growing," Auntie Rita's voice cut through the quiet like a whip. "You are pregnant, aren't you, you worthless girl?" Grace's hands froze on the mop, her heart pounding against her ribs. The truth she had been hiding for months lay exposed, as raw and vulnerable as she felt. Before she could speak, Auntie Rita's hand gripped her arm, dragging her into the living room where Mr. Joseph sat reading his newspaper. "Look what this shameless girl has done." Auntie Rita's voice shook with rage. "This prostitute is carrying a child." The beating came first, fists and open palms until Grace's body ached. Then came the questions, hurled at her like stones. "Who is responsible? Tell us now." Through swollen lips, Grace whispered the truth. "It's Paul." The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Joseph's face darkened with fury. "Liar!" he roared. "My son would never touch filth like you." Paul was called home from work. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of indifference as Grace knelt on the floor, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged, "tell them the truth." But Paul's denial was swift and cruel. "I've never touched her," he said coldly. "She's lying to trap me. Everyone knows she's been seeing men from the street." The words cut deeper than any physical blow. Grace watched her last hope of justice crumble as Paul, the father of her unborn child, turned away without a flicker of remorse. That night, they threw her out with nothing but the clothes on her back. "Never come near this house again," Mr. Joseph warned, "or you'll regret it." Grace found shelter in a tiny room at the edge of town, working as a cleaner in a local school. Her belly grew larger, but her hopes grew smaller with each passing day. When labor came, she faced it alone in a public hospital where the nurses treated her with barely concealed disdain. Ebuka came into the world crying loudly, his tiny fists raised as if ready to fight. "Your son is strong," the midwife said, a rare moment of kindness in months of judgment. Grace held him close, counting his perfect fingers and toes, seeing Paul's features in his small face. "I will protect you," she whispered to her newborn son, "no matter what it takes." But protection proved harder than she imagined. As Ebuka grew, so did the whispers in their neighborhood. Children can be cruel, but adults were crueler, their judgments wrapped in false piety. "Look at that fatherless child," they would say, loud enough for both Grace and Ebuka to hear. "Born in sin." By age 5, Ebuka began asking questions. Each question broke Grace's heart anew. She created a story of a father working abroad, promising to return one day. She would say, wiping away Ebuka's tears. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but seeing hope bloom in her son's eyes made it worthwhile. Yet every night after Ebuka fell asleep, Grace would cry silently, praying for strength to keep going. While Grace struggled to raise their son, Paul's life took a different turn. He married a woman from a wealthy family, moved into a bigger house, and seemed to have everything he wanted. But happiness proved elusive. His wife's first miscarriage came 6 months into their marriage. "These things happen," the doctor said, but then came another and another. Each loss carved deeper lines into Paul's face, each failed pregnancy a reminder of the child he had denied. The final blow came during his wife's 4th pregnancy. She had carried the baby longer this time, hope building with each passing month. But complications arose during labor, and in one cruel moment, Paul lost both his wife and child. Standing in the empty nursery they had prepared, Paul felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. Memories of Grace, of his cruel denial, haunted his sleepless nights. Was this God's punishment for his sins? Depression settled over him like a heavy cloud. He threw himself into work, driving his taxi longer hours, trying to outrun his guilt. But fate had other plans. That fateful evening, Paul drove through the busy streets of Lagos, his mind heavy with grief. It had been exactly 1 year since he lost his wife and unborn child. The memory of her final moments in the hospital haunted him still. "Take care of our baby," she had whispered before slipping away forever. Now he had neither wife nor child to care for. Rain threatened in the darkening sky as Paul navigated through the rush-hour traffic. Street vendors weaved between cars, their voices competing with the honking horns and rumbling engines. Paul barely registered them, lost in his thoughts until a flash of movement caught his eye. A small boy darted between vehicles, clutching a crate of water bottles, his thin arms strained under the weight, his worn clothes hanging loose on his frame. For a split second, their eyes met through the windshield, the boy's gaze filled with a determination that struck Paul's heart. Then everything happened at once. A motorcycle swerved suddenly, causing the boy to stumble backward. Paul slammed on his brakes, but it was too late. The sickening thud, the scatter of water bottles across the wet asphalt, the horrified gasps from onlookers, it all seemed to happen in slow motion. "Oh God, no!" Paul's cry echoed in the sudden silence as he rushed from his car. The boy lay motionless, rain beginning to fall on his still form. Water bottles rolled across the road like fallen soldiers, their plastic surfaces reflecting the gathering storm. Paul's medical training from his youth kicked in as he knelt beside the child. "Someone call an ambulance," he shouted, checking for a pulse with trembling fingers. The boy's skin felt cold, but a faint heartbeat fluttered under Paul's touch. "He's just a water hawker," someone in the crowd muttered. "These children are always causing trouble." The words struck Paul like physical blows. How many times had he driven past such children without a second thought? How many times had he dismissed their struggles as someone else's problem? "He's someone's son," Paul snapped, shrugging off his jacket to cover the boy. Rain fell harder now, washing small rivers of blood into the gutter. Paul lifted the child carefully, cradling him against his chest. "I am taking him to the hospital myself. We can't wait for an ambulance." In his car, Paul drove with one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back to keep the boy stable. "Hold on, son," he whispered, using the term unconsciously. "Please hold on." At First Memorial Hospital, Paul burst through the emergency room doors, the limp child in his arms. "Doctor, please help him." Dr. Adebayo, a veteran of 20 years in emergency medicine, took one look at the situation and sprang into action. "Trauma Room 1, he barked. "What's the boy's name?" I don't know," Paul admitted, watching helplessly as nurses transferred the child to a gurney. "He was selling water on the street. I hit him with my car." Time seemed to crawl as the medical team worked. Paul paced the hallway, his clothes still wet from the rain, his hands stained with the boy's blood. Every few minutes, a nurse would hurry past with supplies or blood bags, each movement increasing his anxiety. Finally, Dr. Adebayo emerged, his face grave. "The boy needs blood urgently," he announced. "He has a rare blood type, and our bank is critically low, without an immediate transfusion." He left the sentence unfinished. "Test mine," Paul said immediately, already rolling up his sleeve. "I'll pay whatever it costs, just save him. I can't have another death on my conscience." The match was perfect, a coincidence that would later prove to be destiny's hand at work. As Paul lay on the adjacent bed, watching his blood flow through the tube into the boy's veins, an inexplicable connection formed. Time seemed to slow as he studied the child's features, the curve of his jaw, the set of his brow, something hauntingly familiar that he couldn't quite place. He didn't know he was saving his own son, the child he had denied 10 years ago. "The transfusion is working," Dr. Adebayo noted, checking the boy's vitals. "His color is improving. You may have saved his life, Mr. Paul." The words struck deeper than they should have. After losing his wife and unborn child, after years of failed pregnancies and shattered hopes, here he was, helping to save a stranger's son. The irony of it all brought unexpected tears to his eyes. Hours passed in the sterile hospital room. Paul refused to leave, watching the steady rise and fall of the boy's chest. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside this room, a fragile peace had settled. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting drips, each one remarking on Paul's dedication to a child he'd accidentally hit. "Most people would have just left him," one nurse commented, "or dropped him at the hospital and gone." Paul couldn't explain why he stayed. Perhaps it was guilt over the accident, or maybe something deeper, a need to prove he could protect a child after failing to save his own. When Ebuka finally regained consciousness 2 days later, his eyes opened slowly, filled with confusion and fear. He looked at Paul with blank eyes, no recognition of his past life, his mother, or his struggles. The trauma of the accident had wiped his memory clean, leaving only questions behind. "Where am I?" the boy whispered, his voice weak and frightened. "Who are you?" Something in that innocent, lost gaze moved Paul deeply. He saw in this child all the chances he'd lost, all the failures that haunted his nights. But he also saw something else, an opportunity for redemption. "I'll take care of him," Paul told Dr. Adebayo, his voice firm with conviction. "Until his family is found. He needs proper care during recovery, and I have a large house, more than enough resources." The doctor studied Paul carefully. "This is a significant responsibility, Mr. Paul. The boy's memory loss could be temporary or permanent. He'll need patience, support, medical follow-ups." "I understand," Paul interrupted, "but I can't explain it. I feel responsible for him, not just because of the accident, but something more. Please let me help him." After extensive discussions with social services and the hospital administration, Paul was allowed to take temporary custody of the boy. He arranged the spare room that had once been meant for his own child, buying new clothes, books, and toys. It felt like preparing for the son he'd never had the chance to welcome. When Mr. Joseph visited that first evening, his reaction was unexpected. Standing in the doorway of the boy's new room, watching the child sleep, the older man's face showed a mix of confusion and recognition. Here is something familiar about this boy," he mused, studying Ebuka's features in the soft lamplight. "The way he holds himself, the shape of his face. He reminds me of you at that age, Paul." Paul felt it too, a strange pull, a sense of connection he couldn't explain. Each time he looked at the boy, something tugged at his memory, like a word on the tip of his tongue. Perhaps it was guilt over his wife's death, or maybe God's way of giving him a second chance. Whatever the reason, he threw himself into caring for Ebuka with a dedication that surprised everyone. In the days that followed, Paul found himself showing the boy a father's love that came naturally, unexpectedly. He didn't know he was finally giving his own son the care and affection he had denied him all those years ago. The universe, it seemed, had found a way to bring father and son together, though neither knew the truth of their connection. Grace's world collapsed when Ebuka didn't return home. Her search led her through dangerous streets, calling his name until her voice gave out. When a neighbor mentioned seeing a boy hit by a car, her heart nearly stopped. The hospital confirmed her worst fears and greatest hopes. Ebuka was alive, but had been taken in by none other than Paul. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. "The man who brought him in saved his life with his own blood. He's taken the boy home while he recovers." Now, standing outside the familiar gates of Paul's house, Grace faced the cruelest decision of her life. Inside, she could see Ebuka sitting at a table, clean clothes replacing his torn ones, fresh food before him instead of water bottles to sell. Paul hovered nearby, showing a tenderness that made Grace's heart ache with both gratitude and rage. Should she step forward and reclaim her son, exposing Paul's past sins? Or should she step back, letting Ebuka live the life she had never been able to give him with a father who, though once cruel, now seemed capable of love? The weight of 10 years of struggle pressed down on her as she watched through the gates. Ebuka's dream of having a father had come true in the most twisted way imaginable. The man who had denied him was now caring for him, unknowingly showing love to his own flesh and blood. Grace's hand trembled on the gate latch. One push would change everything, but would the truth set them free or destroy the fragile happiness her son had found? The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the compound as Grace made her decision. The choice she made would alter their lives forever. To be continued in Part 3.